Take a moment to settle yourself comfortably wherever you are. Perhaps adjust your pillow, pull your blankets a little closer, and let your breathing naturally slow as we prepare to journey together into the distant past. Tonight, we're going to explore something that modern life has made almost impossible for us to truly understand. What it was like when the sun went down in a world without electricity, without streetlights, without the gentle hum of civilization that continues through our modern nights. Imagine, if you will, the profound darkness that descended upon medieval cities when twilight faded. This was not the soft darkness of our contemporary evenings, punctuated by glowing windows and the steady presence of light switches within arm's reach. This was a darkness so complete, so enveloping, that it fundamentally shaped every aspect of human behavior, from the rhythm of daily life to the very architecture of fear and survival. Tonight, we'll walk together through these shadowed streets, feeling our way past the challenges that made nighttime not a time of leisure or entertainment, but a period of endurance to be survived. We'll witness the Great Fire of London as it consumed a sleeping city, explore the mysterious world of medieval night watchmen who have left only whispers in historical records, and finally contrast this world of darkness with the torch-lit revelries of the wealthy, whose fires could push back the night, at least within the walls of their grand estates. But first, let us begin where most people of the medieval world began each evening, huddled in their homes, listening to the settling sounds of a city preparing to endure another long night, hoping that dawn would find them safe, warm, and still breathing. Picture yourself standing at the threshold of a modest dwelling in a medieval city, perhaps London in the 14th century, or Paris, or any of the countless urban centers that dotted the European landscape. The sun has just disappeared behind the jagged skyline of thatched roofs and timber walls, and already you can feel the familiar weight of evening anxiety settling over the neighborhood like a heavy cloak. The darkness that approaches is not gradual. There are no streetlights to ease the transition, no glowing shop windows to soften the edges of twilight. Instead, the light simply vanishes. One moment you can make out the familiar shape of the bakery across the narrow street. The next, it has dissolved into an impenetrable wall of black. This is total darkness in a way that few of us have ever experienced. Darkness so complete that you literally cannot see your own hand extended before your face. Feel the immediate disorientation as your world shrinks to whatever small circle of reality you can confirm through touch and hearing. The cobblestones beneath your feet, when there are cobblestones at all, become treacherous obstacles. More often, you're navigating packed earth that turns to mud with the slightest moisture, riddled with ruts, and holes that could easily turn an ankle or send you sprawling into something far less pleasant than dirt. Because the smells. Imagine the assault on your senses as the cooling air settles and concentrates the odors of urban life. There is no sanitation system as we understand it. Human waste flows in open channels down the center of many streets, mixing with animal droppings from horses, pigs, chickens, and dogs. The smell of rotting food, scraps thrown from windows, mingles with the acrid smoke from countless small fires, the sour scent of ale and wine from taverns, and the metallic odor of the various trades, blacksmiths, tanners, butchers, whose work never quite washes clean from the air. Now add to this sensory chaos the bone-deep cold that seeps through your woolen clothing. Medieval buildings were not insulated, as we understand insulation. Heat existed only in small pockets around fires, and once you stepped away from a hearth, the cold claimed you immediately. In winter, this cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. Imagine feeling it creep up through your thin leather shoes, poorly fitted and offering little protection against the damp. Feel it settle into your joints, making every movement stiff and painful. The sounds of the medieval night were a constant reminder of danger and discomfort. Dogs barked incessantly, not the well-fed pets of modern suburbia, but lean, half-wild creatures competing for scraps and territory. Drunken voices echoed from taverns, sometimes dissolving into violence that spilled onto the streets. The sick coughed and moaned from open windows. Tuberculosis, plague, countless diseases that had no cure and no mercy. But perhaps most unsettling were the sounds you couldn't identify. A splash in the darkness that might be someone emptying a chamber pot, or might be something far more sinister. Footsteps that stopped when yours stopped. The creak of shutters that could signal a neighbor checking for intruders, or could be an intruder checking for victims. Crime flourished in this darkness like a disease in stagnant water. Robbery was not just common, it was almost expected. Imagine clutching whatever small valuables you possess, knowing that in this blackness help might be mere feet away and yet completely unreachable. The city's few constables and watchmen were scattered thin, often corrupt, and frequently more concerned with protecting the wealthy districts than patrolling the narrow alleys where most people lived. Fire represented perhaps the greatest terror of all. With buildings constructed primarily of wood and thatch, with open flames as the only source of light and heat, with water supplies limited and often contaminated, fire was both necessity and nemesis. Picture the horrible irony. You needed fire to see, to cook, to stay warm enough to survive, yet that same fire could consume your home, your family, your entire neighborhood in a matter of minutes. The few people brave enough or desperate enough to venture out after dark moved like cautious animals. They hugged walls, feeling their way from landmark to landmark. They traveled in groups when possible, but even groups could be overwhelmed by larger groups of those with nothing left to lose. They carried small lanterns when they could afford them, but these created almost as much danger as safety. The flickering light made them visible to predators while barely illuminating the hazards in their path. Women faced additional dangers that we can only hint at in polite company. The darkness provided cover for the worst impulses of desperate men, and the legal system offered little protection or recourse for victims. Many women simply never left their homes after sunset unless accompanied by male relatives, effectively making them prisoners of the night. Children learned early to fear the darkness, not just the rational fears of cold and crime, but the deep, primal terror of the unknown. Their world was filled with stories of creatures that hunted in the night, stories that, while fantastical, reflected very real dangers. A child who wandered too far from home after dark might never return, lost to accident, violence, or simply the overwhelming disorientation of total darkness. Even the wealthy, with their larger homes and more numerous servants, lived with constant anxiety about fire, theft, and violence. Their homes were fortified not just against armies, but against the desperate masses who surrounded them. Iron bars on windows, heavy wooden doors barred from within, guards who themselves might pose as much danger as protection. The rhythm of medieval urban life was dictated by this reality. Work began at first light and ended well before sunset. Social activities, trade, education, all of life compressed into the precious hours when vision was possible. The night was for sleep, for waiting, for survival. Picture a typical evening in such a city. As the sun begins to set, you can observe the transformation. Shutters slam closed with finality. Doors are barred and bolted. The few remaining people on the streets move with increasing urgency, rushing to reach safety before full darkness falls. The city, so alive with activity during the day, becomes a hollow shell, filled only with the sounds of fear and discomfort. Those who must work at night, bakers preparing for morning, innkeepers serving late travelers, midwives attending births, do so at tremendous personal risk and cost. Their lives are measured not in years, but in the number of times they've successfully navigated the dangerous transition from daylight to dawn. And yet, people endured. generation after generation adapted to this rhythm, found ways to create warmth and community within the constraints of darkness and danger. They developed elaborate social codes around hospitality, knowing that turning away a stranger at nightfall might be sentencing them to death. They created networks of mutual protection, neighbors who listened for trouble and were prepared to help when help was possible. The night was their adversary, but it was also their teacher. It taught patience, caution, and the profound value of small comforts: a warm fire, a secure door, the sound of familiar voices in the darkness. It taught them to treasure the dawn, not just as the beginning of another day, but as deliverance from 8 to 12 hours of sustained anxiety and discomfort. As we prepare to move deeper into this world of medieval nights, imagine yourself settling into whatever shelter you've managed to secure. Feel the relief of being inside, of having walls between yourself and the darkness, of knowing you've survived another transition from day to night. Listen to the sounds of a city trying to sleep, the restless movements of people who know that safety is temporary, that dawn is still many dangerous hours away. Let us move forward through the centuries now, from the general medieval world to a specific moment when all the accumulated fears of urban nightlife crystallized into a single catastrophic event. It is the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, and London sleeps fitfully under a canopy of stars that will soon be obscured by something far more sinister than clouds. Picture yourself in the narrow confines of Pudding Lane, in the heart of London's old city. The street is barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably, lined with timber-framed buildings that lean inward toward each other, their upper stories nearly touching across the narrow gap. These buildings, constructed in the medieval tradition that still dominated London's landscape, are testament to centuries of the same nighttime fears we've just explored, huddled together for protection, built tall and narrow to maximize the precious space within the city walls. In the darkness of Thomas Farriner's bakehouse, the dying embers of the day's baking fires should be settling into harmless ash. But tonight, something has gone wrong. Perhaps a spark has found its way to a pile of faggots, bundles of dry wood used to fuel the ovens. Perhaps the wind, which has been unusually strong for several days, has breathed life into coals that should have been safely extinguished. We will never know the exact moment of ignition, but we can imagine the first tentative flickers of light beginning to dance against the wooden walls of the shop. The bakehouse, like most buildings of its era, is a tinderbox waiting for exactly this moment. The timber is old and dry, seasoned by decades of London's smoky air. The walls are filled with straw and other combustible materials used for insulation. Above the shop, Thomas Farriner and his family sleep in rooms that are essentially kindling boxes suspended over what is about to become an inferno. Feel the first wisps of smoke beginning to curl through the building, following the patterns of draft and air current that the residents know so well from their daily lives. But smoke in the darkness is different from smoke in daylight. It's invisible until it's overwhelming, a silent killer that can claim lives before anyone realizes the danger. Imagine the moment when Thomas Farriner awakens, not to light, but to heat. The air in his chamber has grown thick and acrid. His first breath brings not the familiar smell of his trade, but the harsh bite of smoke that sends him into immediate, choking panic. In the complete darkness of a London night, he cannot see the smoke, but he can feel it filling his lungs, can taste the bitter promise of the fire below. Picture the terrible disorientation as he tries to rouse his family. In daylight, they could quickly assess the situation, gather necessary belongings, plan an escape route. But in this darkness, every second of precious time is lost to confusion and blindness. They must navigate by touch and memory through rooms that are rapidly filling with deadly smoke, past furniture and obstacles that have become invisible traps. The family's escape, crawling across rooftops in the pitch darkness, feeling their way from building to building, while flames begin to lick at the structures behind them, illustrates perfectly the vulnerability that defined medieval and early modern urban life. They cannot see where they're going, cannot judge the safety of each step, cannot know if the next roof will support their weight or collapse beneath them into the growing inferno below. But their escape is only the beginning of the nightmare that will engulf London for the next 4 days and nights. As the fire takes hold of the bakehouse, it begins to spread with a hunger that seems almost intelligent in its efficiency. The buildings of Pudding Lane, constructed according to the same principles that had governed London's architecture for centuries, provide perfect fuel and perfect conditions for the fire's growth. Picture the scene as neighbors begin to realize what is happening. In the darkness, the fire's glow provides the first real light that many of these people have seen since sunset, but it's a light that promises destruction rather than comfort. The narrow streets that provided security and community during peaceful nights now become death traps, channels that direct the fire from building to building with ruthless efficiency. The wind, which has been building for days, transforms from a natural nuisance into an active participant in the disaster. Imagine standing in one of these narrow lanes as the fire approaches, feeling the wind whipping around the tight corners and confined spaces, carrying sparks and burning debris like malevolent messengers. The very architecture that protected Londoners from human predators now conspires with the elements to spread destruction with unprecedented speed. As word of the fire begins to spread through the sleeping city, we can observe how the limitations of nighttime communication turn a local emergency into a city-wide catastrophe. There are no streetlights to guide messengers, no clear sightlines to assess the fire's progress, no efficient way to coordinate a response. People wake to the smell of smoke and the distant glow of flames, but in the darkness, they cannot judge whether the danger is immediate or distant, whether they should flee or prepare to fight. The fire services of 1666 London were primitive, even by the standards of the day. Essentially, groups of men with leather buckets hooks for pulling down burning thatch and primitive fire engines that were little more than large syringes on wheels. But even these inadequate resources are rendered nearly useless by the darkness. Imagine the frustration of firefighters who cannot see the extent of the flames, cannot navigate safely through streets they know well in daylight, cannot coordinate their efforts or communicate effectively with other groups working nearby. As the night progresses, the fire grows from a local emergency into something approaching apocalypse. The flames, fed by the strong wind and the combustible construction of medieval London, begin to leap across streets, to spread faster than people can run, to consume entire neighborhoods before their residents can organize any meaningful response. Picture the growing stream of refugees fleeing through London's dark streets, families clutching whatever possessions they could gather in those crucial first minutes, children crying in confusion and terror, elderly residents who have lived their entire lives in neighborhoods that are disappearing behind them in pillars of smoke and flame. They move through streets they cannot see, past landmarks that are either invisible in the darkness or already consumed by the advancing fire. The Thames, London's great river, becomes a highway of escape, but even here, the darkness creates additional dangers. Boats collide in the river's black waters. People, desperate to escape the flames, leap into wherries and barges that are already overloaded. Some, unable to find boat passage, attempt to swim across the Thames in the darkness, many never reaching the far shore. As dawn finally approaches on September 2nd, the residents of London who have survived the first night of the fire witness a sight that confirms their worst nighttime fears made manifest. The morning light reveals not the familiar skyline of their city, but a landscape transformed into something hellish and unrecognizable. Entire districts have vanished. St. Paul's Cathedral, the ancient Gothic structure that had dominated London's skyline for centuries, stands wreathed in flames, its lead roof beginning to melt and pour into the streets below like molten rivers. But the fire does not respect the boundary between night and day. As September 2nd progresses, the flames continue their relentless advance, and Londoners realize that they face not just one terrible night, but potentially many more. The fire burns through the second night, the third, the fourth, each evening bringing fresh terrors as the wind continues to drive the flames through neighborhoods that had seemed safely distant just hours before. The psychological impact of these burning nights cannot be overstated. For generations, Londoners had lived with the abstract fear of fire, the knowledge that it could happen, the precautions taken against it, the constant awareness of the danger. But the Great Fire transformed these fears from possibilities into lived reality. It showed how quickly the familiar could become alien, how rapidly the protective could become deadly. Consider the experience of those who witnessed the fire from a distance, residents of areas that were eventually spared, but who spent night after night watching the glow grow larger on their horizon, breathing air thick with smoke and ash, not knowing whether the next shift of the wind would send the flames toward their own homes. The darkness that had always been their enemy now carried the additional terror of uncertainty. They could hear the fire's roar, could smell its smoke, could see its glow, but could not judge its distance or direction. The fire also revealed the social stratifications that defined London life. The wealthy, with their stone houses and wider streets, found that their neighborhoods were more resistant to the flames, not through any superior virtue, but through the accident of better building materials and urban planning. The poor, crowded into the ancient timber districts near the river, bore the brunt of the destruction. Their world of narrow lanes and wooden buildings, which had provided community and affordability, became the fire's most efficient fuel. When the Great Fire finally burned itself out on September 6th, it had consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the buildings within the old Roman city walls. But perhaps more significantly, it had burned away the illusion of safety that had allowed Londoners to sleep peacefully in their timber houses, surrounded by the familiar dangers of urban nightlife. The aftermath of the fire transformed not just London's architecture. The new buildings would be constructed of brick and stone, with wider streets and better access for firefighting, but also the psychology of urban living. The Great Fire had taken the abstract fears that had haunted medieval nights and made them concrete, undeniable, catastrophic. As we leave London in the smoky aftermath of those terrible September nights, carrying with us the image of a city reborn from ash and terror, we turn our attention to those who made it their profession to stand guard against such disasters. The night watchmen, whose traces in history are as elusive as the shadows they patrolled. In the ghostly hours between sunset and dawn, when most of medieval Europe huddled behind barred doors and shuttered windows, a small number of men took up the responsibility of walking the darkness. These were the night watchmen, figures so peripheral to recorded history that we must piece together their existence from fragments and whispers, from archaeological hints and the occasional mention in legal documents when something went terribly wrong. Imagine yourself following one of these solitary figures as he begins his evening rounds in a 13th century English town. Perhaps his name is William or Thomas or Edmund, common names that appear in the few records we possess, attached to men whose daily lives were so ordinary that history barely bothered to preserve them. Yet these unremarkable men undertook one of the most remarkable tasks of their age. They chose to inhabit the night. Picture William as he prepares for his watch. He is not a young man. This work typically fell to those past their prime for more physically demanding labor, men in their 40s and 50s, whose bodies bore the accumulated wear of medieval life. His clothing is practical rather than impressive. A thick woolen cloak that will provide some protection against the cold leather boots that have been mended multiple times, and perhaps a felt cap that can be pulled down to protect his ears from the bitter wind that sweeps through the narrow streets. His equipment speaks to the precarious nature of his profession. A lantern, if he is fortunate enough to work in a town wealthy enough to provide one, containing a precious candle or oil flame that must be carefully protected from the wind. A staff or cudgel, more for feeling his way through the darkness than for fighting, though it serves both purposes when necessary. A bell or wooden clapper to raise alarms, and perhaps a horn whose mournful call could summon help from other watchmen stationed throughout the town. But what strikes you most about William is not what he carries, but what he lacks. He has no armor, no sword, no significant authority backed by law or noble privilege. He is essentially an ordinary man who has agreed to make himself a target in exchange for a small payment and the vague gratitude of his sleeping neighbors. Follow him now as he begins his rounds, stepping from the relative warmth and safety of the guardhouse, if such a building exists, into the complete darkness of the medieval night. Feel the immediate transformation that occurs as the door closes behind him. The familiar world of daylight has vanished, replaced by a landscape that exists primarily in memory, touch, and sound. His first challenge is navigation. The streets he knows perfectly in daylight become alien territory in darkness. William must rely on a mental map built from years of experience, feeling his way from landmark to landmark. The corner of the baker's shop, the stone cross in the market square, the distinctive gateposts of the church. Each step requires careful consideration. Each turn must be confirmed by touch and instinct. The archaeological evidence of these men's work is frustratingly sparse, hidden in the shadows of history, much like the watchmen themselves. Excavations of medieval towns occasionally reveal objects that might have belonged to them. Iron-tipped staves that could serve as walking sticks and weapons, fragments of lanterns, bells of the type used to raise alarms. But these artifacts tell us little about the men who carried them or the experiences that defined their nights. What we do know comes primarily from court records and town regulations, documents that typically mention watchmen only when something has gone wrong. A watchman accused of sleeping on duty, another charged with theft, a third found dead in an alley, the circumstances mysterious and unresolved. These legal fragments paint a picture of men operating on the margins of society, trusted with significant responsibility but given little support or protection. Consider the psychological toll of this work. Night after night, William walks through streets that most people consider too dangerous to traverse. He encounters the desperate and the criminal, the sick and the dying, the drunk and the violent. He witnesses domestic disputes that spill into the streets, discovers the bodies of those who didn't survive the night's cold or violence, and faces the constant possibility that he himself might become a victim of the darkness he patrols. The loneliness of the work is perhaps its most defining characteristic. While most of medieval society functions through networks of family, guild, and community support, the night watchman operates in isolation. His colleagues are scattered throughout the town, too distant to provide immediate assistance. His family sleeps while he works, creating a temporal separation that compounds his physical isolation. Yet, there are hints in the historical record that these men developed their own forms of community and communication. Town records occasionally mention systems of signals, horn calls with specific meanings, bell patterns that could convey different types of information. Archaeological evidence suggests that some watchmen may have maintained small fires at strategic points throughout their routes, both for warmth and as signal beacons. Picture William pausing at one of these fire posts, perhaps a brazier set up in the shelter of a church porch or market stall. For a few precious minutes he can warm his hands and feet, can see beyond the small circle of his lantern's light, can feel connected to the human world of warmth and illumination, but he cannot linger long. The darkness is vast, and his route covers territory that would take hours to complete, even in daylight. The cultural significance of night watchmen extended beyond their practical function. In a society where darkness was associated with evil, chaos, and spiritual danger, these men served as human talismans against the unknown. Their presence on the streets was as much psychological as practical, proof that civilization had not completely surrendered to the forces of night. Religious overtones colored their work in ways that are difficult for modern audiences to appreciate fully. Many watchmen began their shifts with prayers, asking for divine protection during the dangerous hours ahead. Some carried religious medallions or amulets, believing that spiritual as well as physical armament was necessary for survival. The church bells that marked the passage of night hours served not just as timekeepers, but as reminders that divine order persisted even in the realm of darkness. The few personal accounts that survive, usually in the form of testimony during legal proceedings, reveal glimpses of the watchman's inner world. One 14th century court record describes a watchman who claimed to recognize regular patterns in the night sounds of his district. The distinctive cough of a consumptive woman in a particular house, the restless pacing of an insomniac merchant, the periodic crying of a colicky infant. These men became intimate with the rhythms of sleeping communities in ways that no one else could match. Archaeological investigations of medieval town centers sometimes reveal modifications to buildings that may relate to watchmen's activities. Stone steps worn smooth in patterns that suggest regular use during hours when most traffic would be minimal. Small alcoves or niches in walls that might have provided shelter during the worst weather. Scorch marks on stone surfaces that could indicate regular placement of torches or braziers. But perhaps the most intriguing archaeological evidence comes from the analysis of medieval latrines and refuse pits. These excavations sometimes reveal collections of objects that suggest someone was regularly moving through the town during night hours. Coins dropped in darkness, personal items lost and not recovered until morning, fragments of clothing that might have been torn during nighttime encounters. The pattern of these discoveries creates a kind of shadow map of medieval nightlife, with the watchmen as its invisible cartographers. The seasonal variations in a watchman's experience would have been extreme. Summer nights, while shorter, brought their own challenges. The increased activity of those who felt more confident moving about in the warmer darkness. The higher likelihood of violence as ail and frustration combined in the heat. But winter was the true test of endurance. Picture William on a February night when darkness falls in mid-afternoon and doesn't lift until well past dawn, when the cold is so intense that his lantern flame struggles to stay lit, when ice makes every step treacherous and frostbite threatens any exposed skin. The mystery of these men deepens when we consider their ultimate fate in the historical record. As cities grew larger and more complex, as professional police forces began to emerge, the night watchman gradually disappeared from medieval society. But this transition happened so slowly and quietly that we have few records of it. These men who had guarded the boundaries between civilization and chaos simply faded back into the darkness they had patrolled. Some historians suggest that the decline of the night watchman was inevitable, as urban centers became more organized and wealthy enough to support more comprehensive security systems. Others argue that changing social attitudes toward night activity, the gradual normalization of evening entertainment and commerce, reduced the symbolic importance of having guardians specifically dedicated to the dark hours. What remains clear is that for several centuries, these anonymous figures served as the thin line between medieval communities and the terrors of night. They walked so that others could sleep. They faced the darkness so that civilization could maintain the illusion of safety. They accepted isolation and danger as the price of providing a small measure of security to their neighbors. As we prepare to leave the shadowy world of the night watchman, carrying with us the image of solitary figures moving through medieval darkness with nothing but courage and duty as companions, we turn toward a very different vision of nighttime in the medieval world. The torchlit halls of the wealthy, where darkness was not endured but banished, where night became a stage for display rather than a trial of survival. Step now through the heavy oak doors of a great manor house on a winter evening in the 14th century, leaving behind the world of scarcity and fear we have inhabited together. Feel the immediate transformation as you cross the threshold from the bitter darkness of the common night into a realm where wealth has purchased something that most of humanity could only dream of: the ability to make night disappear. The great hall stretches before you, a cavernous space that during daylight might seem austere, even forbidding, with its high stone walls and narrow windows. But now, in the deep hours of night, it has been transformed into something approaching magical. Dozens of torches line the walls, their flames dancing in iron sconces that cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across the vaulted ceiling. The very air seems to shimmer with warmth and illumination, creating an island of brightness in the sea of medieval darkness. This is not the tentative, careful light of the common people, a single precious candle hoarded and protected. This is light as luxury, light as statement, light as power. Each torch represents a significant expense: the cost of tallow or oil, the labor required to maintain and replace them throughout the night, the servants whose job it is to ensure that darkness never encroaches upon this privileged space. Imagine yourself settling into this scene of warmth and plenty. The great fireplace at the hall's far end contains not the modest cooking fire of a peasant cottage, but a roaring blaze fed by entire logs, tended by servants whose only responsibility is to ensure that the flames never dim. The heat it throws reaches across the entire hall, creating currents of warm air that carry with them the scents of prosperity: roasted meats, spiced wine, perfumed oils, and the subtle but unmistakable smell of wealth itself. Around the hall's perimeter, tables have been arranged for the evening's feast. But these are not the rough-hewn boards of common taverns. They are draped with fine linen, set with silver plate that reflects the torchlight in brilliant flashes, accompanied by goblets of precious metal that catch and multiply the warm glow of the flames. Even the food, when it arrives, seems to participate in the display of light: glazed meats that gleam, jellies and preserves that sparkle like jewels, wines that glow ruby and gold in their crystal vessels. The contrast with the world beyond these walls could not be more complete. While the night watchman shivers through his rounds, while common families huddle together in single rooms warmed by dying embers, while entire neighborhoods sleep fitfully in darkness, so complete they cannot see their own hands here, the night has been conquered as thoroughly as any military victory. Consider the sheer audacity of this transformation. In a world where night represents death, danger, and deprivation, the wealthy have chosen to treat it as entertainment. They have taken the most fearsome time of the day and converted it into an opportunity for pleasure, display, and social dominance. The very darkness that terrorizes their tenants becomes, within these walls, merely a dramatic backdrop for their own illuminated performance. The guests themselves embody this defiance of natural order. Picture the ladies of the court, their silk gowns flowing like liquid light as they move through the torchlit space, their jewelry catching and scattering reflections with each gesture. Their comfort in this artificial daylight is complete. They laugh, they dance, they engage in the elaborate social rituals of their class as if the hostile darkness beyond these walls simply did not exist. The men, resplendent in velvet and fur, move with the confidence of those who have never known the particular terror of being alone and defenseless in the medieval night. They speak loudly, gesture broadly, their voices filling the vast space with the sound of power, unconstrained by the fear that silences their subjects. For them, night is not a time to endure, but a time to enjoy. Not a period of vulnerability, but an opportunity for display. Music fills the hall. Not the work songs or simple melodies that might accompany daylight labor, but elaborate compositions performed by professional musicians. The sound of lutes, harps, and voices trained in courtly arts creates an acoustic environment, as removed from the sounds of the night streets as the torchlight is removed from common darkness. This is music as luxury, sound as power, harmony as a demonstration that even the natural rhythm of day and night can be overcome by sufficient wealth and will. The feast itself represents perhaps the ultimate expression of this conquest over natural limitation. While common people make their evening meals from whatever scraps they can prepare before darkness falls, while they eat cold food rather than risk the danger of maintaining fires late into the night, the wealthy elite dine on elaborate dishes prepared by teams of servants working through the dangerous hours. Picture course after course arriving at these tables, roasted peacocks presented with their plumage intact, swans and other exotic birds, elaborate pastries sculpted into fantastic shapes, wines and ales imported from distant regions, spices that represent months of dangerous travel and the wealth of nations. Each dish is a declaration that the normal rules of season, of availability, of the natural constraints that govern ordinary life do not apply within these walls. But perhaps most striking is the casual waste that accompanies this display. Torches burn continuously whether anyone is watching them or not. Fires are maintained at full intensity even when the hall is empty. Food is prepared in quantities far beyond what can be consumed, with the excess distributed to servants or simply discarded. In a world where most people carefully conserve every resource against the harsh realities of medieval life, the wealthy elite demonstrate their power through deliberate excess. The architecture itself supports this transformation of night into day. These great halls were designed not merely for shelter, but for spectacle. The high ceilings that would be difficult and expensive to heat serve primarily to create impressive spaces for the display of light and wealth. The stone construction that provides superior fire safety also creates surfaces that reflect and multiply torch flames. Even the narrow windows, while offering little natural light, serve as frames that emphasize the contrast between the darkness outside and the illumination within. Consider the psychological impact of these nightly displays, both on participants and on those excluded from them. For the wealthy, the ability to banish darkness becomes a confirmation of their special status, evidence that they exist above the natural order that constrains ordinary humanity. The very act of feasting and celebrating, while others cower in darkness, serves as a ritual demonstration of power and privilege. For the servants who make these displays possible, the men and women who must venture into the dangerous night to tend fires, fetch supplies, and clean up after these elaborate entertainments, the contrast is both immediate and painful. They move between two worlds, the brilliant, warm realm of their master's pleasure and the cold, dangerous reality of the medieval night that still governs their own lives. The entertainment extends beyond mere feasting and conversation. Picture elaborate dances performed in the shifting light of torches, the dancers' movements creating patterns of shadow and illumination that add to the night's theatrical quality. Storytellers and poets recite tales of adventure and romance, their words accompanied by the dramatic interplay of light and darkness that gives their narratives additional power. Games of chance and skill continue long into the night, with stakes that would represent months or years of income for common workers. The very fact that these nobles can afford to stay awake, to burn through precious resources of light and heat while accomplishing no productive work, serves as a demonstration of their distance from the economic realities that govern most medieval lives. But even within this world of artificial light and abundant warmth, the darkness is never entirely banished. It lurks at the edges of the torchlight, creeps into corners that the flames cannot quite reach, creates pools of shadow that shift and change with every flicker of the flames. The night remains present, contained but not conquered, held at bay by continuous effort and enormous expense. This partial victory over darkness carries with it a certain tension, an awareness that the light is maintained only through constant vigilance and unlimited resources. The torches will eventually burn out, the fires will consume their fuel, and if the servants fail in their duties or the supply of oil and tallow is interrupted, the darkness will reclaim even these privileged spaces. As dawn approaches, though within these halls the approaching daylight is almost irrelevant, so completely has artificial illumination replaced natural rhythms. The elaborate entertainment begins to wind down. But even this conclusion demonstrates the power of wealth. While common people wake to the relief of having survived another dangerous night, the wealthy elite retire from their pleasures with the casual assumption that tomorrow night will bring another opportunity for the same display of power over natural law. The contrast could not be more complete or more deliberate. In the same cities where night watchmen brave mortal danger for a few coins, where families huddle in darkness to conserve precious fuel, where the very act of moving through nighttime streets represents a calculated risk, the wealthy have created spaces where night becomes a stage for pleasure and display. As we prepare to conclude our long journey through the nighttime world of medieval society, carrying with us images of both the terror and the splendor that darkness could contain, we find ourselves returned to a fundamental truth about human nature and social organization, that even in the face of universal challenges like cold, darkness, and danger, wealth and power find ways to create islands of exception, pockets of privilege that exist in defiance of the harsh realities that govern most lives. Imagine yourself as an observer drifting through the smoky streets of industrial London, Manchester, or Birmingham in the 1800s. You're safe in your exploration, able to witness the rhythms of daily life that shaped millions of ordinary people during this transformative era. As you listen, let your mind wander through these historical landscapes, understanding how the vast majority of Victorians lived their daily lives in conditions vastly different from the prosperity we often associate with their age. The story will unfold together, moves through 4 distinct chapters of Victorian existence. We'll begin in the crowded tenements and narrow alleyways where working families made their homes. Then, we'll follow the methodical work of Charles Booth, a man who dedicated years to mapping London's poverty with scientific precision. Our journey will take us into the mysterious shadows of Whitechapel, where fear and folklore intertwined in ways that still capture our imagination today. Finally, we'll ascend to the drawing rooms and country estates of the wealthy, observing how 2 entirely different worlds existed side by side in the same era. So settle back, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift into the gaslit world of Victorian Britain, where the rhythms of industrial life created a tapestry of human experience, both harsh and remarkably resilient. Picture yourself standing at the mouth of a narrow alleyway in London's East End on a typical morning in 1870. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven and slick with moisture that could be morning dew, industrial runoff, or something less pleasant entirely. The air carries a complex mixture of scents, coal smoke drifting down from countless chimneys, the yeasty smell of bread from a nearby bakery, the sharp tang of industrial chemicals, and underneath it all, the persistent odor of too many people living in too small a space. As dawn breaks through the perpetual haze that hangs over the industrial districts, the rhythms of daily life begin to stir around you. The sound of wooden clogs on stone echoes from the main thoroughfare as the early shift workers make their way toward the factories. Children's voices drift from upper-story windows, not the carefree laughter of play, but the practical conversations of young people preparing for another day of adult responsibilities. Imagine yourself following one of these families through their morning routine. The Hartwell family, consisting of Thomas, a factory worker, his wife Mary, and their 4 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, shares 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a converted Georgian house that now shelters 12 families, where once a single wealthy household lived. Their apartment consists of a front room that serves as kitchen, parlor, and workspace, and a smaller back room where all 6 family members sleep. Mary rises first, as she always does, while the city is still cloaked in the dim grey light that passes for dawn in this smoky district. She moves quietly around the cramped space, her movements economical and practiced. The single window in their front room looks out onto the brick wall of the building next door, so close you could reach across the gap and touch it. What little light filters down into their space is already tinged with the yellow-brown hue of coal smoke. Their morning begins with the daily challenge of water. Mary takes the family's single bucket, a battered tin vessel that serves multiple purposes throughout the day, and makes her way down 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs to the courtyard pump that serves all 47 residents of the building. If she's fortunate, the pump will be working and the water will run relatively clear. The local water supply, drawn from wells that are often contaminated by the very sewage systems they're meant to serve, carries an ever-present risk of disease, but it's the only option available. The pump handle requires significant effort to operate, and Mary has developed the particular rhythm necessary to coax a steady flow. She fills her bucket while listening to the familiar sounds of her neighbors beginning their own daily routines. The creak of floorboards overhead, muffled conversations through thin walls, the cry of an infant somewhere in the building's depths. Back in their rooms, Mary portions out the precious water carefully. Some goes into a basin for washing, a quick, efficient process that removes the most obvious grime, but can hardly be called thorough. Some is reserved for cooking, and the remainder must last the family throughout the day for drinking and other necessities. During the summer months, when disease spreads more rapidly through the crowded districts, Mary sometimes boils the drinking water when coal can be spared for the extra fuel, though she's never quite sure whether this helps or simply wastes resources they can ill afford. Thomas stirs as Mary begins preparing what passes for breakfast. Their diet consists primarily of bread, occasionally supplemented with a small portion of bacon fat, jam when it can be afforded, or tea when the family budget allows such luxuries. The bread itself is often adulterated, mixed with alum, chalk, or other substances to increase its weight and the baker's profit. Thomas has learned to identify the telltale signs of these additions, the slightly gritty texture or unusual aftertaste, but he rarely has the luxury of refusing what food is available. The children wake in stages, the younger ones automatically making room as the older ones prepare for their day. There's no privacy in their sleeping arrangements. The entire family shares the small back room with the parents on one side and the children arranged by age and size on the other. Personal space is a concept that belongs to an entirely different social class. 16-year-old Sarah helps her mother with the breakfast preparations while simultaneously mending a tear in her younger brother's shirt. Her hands move with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been contributing meaningfully to the household since she was barely 8 years old. At 16, Sarah works 12 hours a day in a textile factory, operating machinery that requires constant attention and poses daily risks to fingers, hair, and clothing. Her wages, approximately 1/3 of what her father earns, are essential to the family's survival. 14-year-old James prepares for his work as a delivery boy for a local merchant, a position that requires him to navigate the labyrinthine streets of the industrial district while carrying packages that often weigh nearly as much as he does. His day will involve constant walking, frequent interactions with customers who view him as barely above the level of a stray dog, and the ever-present possibility of having wages docked for real or imagined infractions. The two younger children, 9-year-old Emma and 6-year-old William, represent the family's hope for a slightly better future. Recent legislation has made some attempt to limit child labor, and both children spend part of their day in a ragged school, a charitable institution that provides basic literacy and numeracy instruction to working-class children. However, even these youngest family members contribute to the household economy. Emma helps with piecework that Mary takes in, sewing buttons onto cards or assembling small items that can be completed at home. William runs errands for neighbors and collects any usable materials he finds during his travels through the district. As the family prepares to scatter to their various daily obligations, imagine yourself observing the careful choreography of their departure. Thomas leaves first, joining the stream of workers heading toward the factory district. His workday will consist of 12 to 14 hours in a building where the air is thick with cotton fibers, metal dust, or chemical vapors, depending on the specific industry. The noise level in most factories makes normal conversation impossible, and workers develop their own systems of hand signals and gestures to communicate necessary information. The factory environment poses constant dangers. Unguarded machinery operates at high speeds with minimal safety precautions. Workers who lose focus for even a moment risk serious injury. Thomas has seen colleagues lose fingers to unguarded gears, suffer burns from hot metal or chemicals, or develop respiratory problems from prolonged exposure to industrial dust. The concept of worker compensation or medical leave belongs to a future not yet imagined by most employers. Sarah follows shortly after her father, but her route takes her toward a different section of the industrial district. The textile factory where she works employs primarily women and children who are considered more suited to the delicate work of operating spinning machines and power looms. The factory floor is a maze of machinery, with narrow walkways between rows of equipment that seems to pulse and breathe with its own mechanical life. The working conditions in Sarah's factory reflect the particular challenges faced by female workers during this era. The air is filled with cotton fibers that stick to clothing, hair, and skin, creating a constant coating of white dust on everything and everyone. The noise is overwhelming, a combination of mechanical clattering, steam hissing, and the sounds of hundreds of machines operating simultaneously. Workers quickly learn to read lips and communicate through exaggerated gestures, as shouting is both impossible and useless in this environment. Temperature control is non-existent. During summer months, the combination of body heat from hundreds of workers and heat generated by the machinery creates an almost unbearable environment. Windows are kept closed to prevent drafts that might affect the delicate cotton fibers, so fresh air is virtually non-existent. During winter, the same buildings become bitter cold, with only the heat from the machinery providing any warmth. Workers dress in layers that can be adjusted throughout the day, but finding the right balance between warmth and mobility is a daily challenge. James's workday unfolds differently, but is no less demanding. As a delivery boy, he represents one of the few opportunities for working-class children to move relatively freely through different social and economic areas of the city. His routes often take him from the cramped quarters of his own neighborhood through the commercial districts where middle-class shoppers browse goods that would represent months of his family's income, and occasionally into the residential areas where the wealthy live in houses that could shelter dozens of families like his own. These journeys provide James with a unique perspective on the vast disparities of Victorian society. He observes the clean streets, well-maintained buildings, and obvious prosperity of the upper-class districts, contrasting sharply with the conditions of his own neighborhood. The people he encounters in these areas treat him with a mixture of indifference and mild suspicion. He's useful for his services, but barely acknowledged as a human being deserving of courtesy or consideration. The physical demands of James's work are considerable. He carries packages weighing up to 30 or 40 pounds over distances that might total 10 or 15 miles during a single workday. His routes are planned for efficiency rather than his comfort, and he quickly learns to navigate shortcuts through alleys, courtyards, and informal pathways that don't appear on any official map. He develops an intimate knowledge of the city's geography that would rival any cab driver, along with the street wisdom necessary to avoid the more dangerous areas during certain times of day. Back in the family's cramped quarters, Mary begins her own complex daily routine. While her husband and older children contribute wages to the family economy, Mary's role involves managing the household's survival on those meager resources, while simultaneously pursuing additional income through various forms of home-based work. Mary's morning hours are dedicated to what Victorian society calls taking in washing, accepting laundry from middle-class families who can afford to pay for the service, but not enough to employ full-time domestic help. The process is both labor-intensive and space-consuming. Mary has arranged with several neighboring families to share the use of a large copper washing tub that's housed in the building's basement. The work involves hauling numerous buckets of water up and down the stairs, heating the water over a fire that must be carefully maintained throughout the washing process. Scrubbing heavily soiled items by hand and then finding space to hang the wet laundry to dry. The basement washing area is a dim, damp space that serves all the families in the building. The air is thick with steam, soap fumes, and the accumulated odors of the neighborhood's laundry needs. Mary works alongside her neighbors, women who have become intimate acquaintances through shared labor rather than social choice. They've developed their own informal systems of cooperation, sharing soap when one family runs short, helping with particularly difficult stains, and watching each other's younger children who are too small to be left alone upstairs. During the drying process, wet laundry transforms the family's already cramped living space into an obstacle course of hanging garments. Ropes are strung across both rooms, and every available surface is covered with drying clothing. The moisture from the drying laundry increases the humidity in the already poorly ventilated space, contributing to the persistent dampness that makes the rooms feel cold even when they're not. In addition to the washing work, Mary takes in piecework from various manufacturers, simple assembly tasks that can be completed at home. This might involve sewing buttons onto cards, assembling small mechanical items, or packaging goods for retail sale. The pay for this work is minimal, calculated to provide just enough incentive for desperate families to accept it while maximizing the manufacturer's profit. Mary might spend hours completing a task that earns only a few pence, but those pence can make the difference between having bread for dinner or going hungry. The youngest children, Emma and William, experience a childhood that would be almost unrecognizable to children of more fortunate circumstances. Their play is structured around the practical needs of survival rather than entertainment or development. Emma's dolls are made from scraps of fabric and bits of string, and her games often involve mimicking the adult activities she observes daily, washing clothes, cooking meals, and caring for younger children. William's adventures take place in the streets and courtyards of the neighborhood, where he joins informal groups of children engaged in activities that combine play with practical learning. They might spend hours exploring the network of cellars, courtyards and rooftops that make up their urban environment, developing the navigation skills and street knowledge that will serve them throughout their lives. Their games often involve elements of scavenging, finding useful materials that adults might have overlooked, identifying which shops might have scraps or damaged goods available for free, and learning to distinguish between materials that have value and those that are truly worthless. The educational opportunities available to Emma and William are limited, but represent genuine progress compared to previous generations. The ragged school they attend operates in a converted warehouse with volunteer teachers who provide basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The school supplies are minimal. Children share slate boards and chalk, and textbooks are worn volumes that have passed through countless hands. The school environment reflects the practical challenges of educating working-class children. Students arrive at different times, depending on their family obligations. Attendance is irregular due to the need for children to work when extra income opportunities arise, and the age range in any given classroom might span from 6 to 14 years old. Teachers must simultaneously manage instruction for children, reading their first words, alongside others who are already functionally literate. Despite these limitations, both Emma and William are learning skills that could potentially offer them opportunities their parents never had. Emma shows particular aptitude for arithmetic, an ability that might eventually qualify her for work in a shop or office rather than factory labor. William demonstrates artistic talent, sketching detailed pictures of the people and places around him with whatever materials he can find. As the day progresses toward evening, imagine yourself observing the gradual return of the family members to their shared quarters. Thomas arrives first, his clothing and exposed skin darkened with the accumulated grime of his factory work. The particular nature of his job means he carries home traces of the industrial environment, metal filings embedded under his fingernails, chemical residues that have absorbed into his clothing, and the persistent odor of machinery oil and industrial solvents. Thomas's evening routine begins with the challenging process of cleaning himself as thoroughly as possible with the limited water and soap available. He strips to the waist and washes with cold water from the same basin used for morning washing, trying to remove the day's accumulation of industrial residue. The soap is harsh and leaves his already rough hands chapped and cracked, but it's necessary to remove at least the surface layer of grime. Sarah arrives home shortly after her father, her own appearance telling the story of her workday. Cotton fibers cling to her hair and clothing, and her hands show the small cuts and abrasions that result from working with rapidly moving machinery. She's developed a particular way of walking that favors her left foot, the result of a minor injury suffered when a piece of machinery caught the edge of her shoe. Such injuries are commonplace and rarely receive medical attention unless they're severe enough to prevent work entirely. James's return marks the beginning of the family's evening meal preparation. His workday often extends longer than his father's or sister's, as delivery schedules depend on the needs of customers rather than factory hours. His clothing shows the wear patterns characteristic of someone who spends most of their time walking worn shoe soles, frayed trouser cuffs, and the particular type of exhaustion that comes from being constantly in motion. The family's evening meal represents both the culmination of the day's economic efforts and the stark reality of their financial limitations. Mary has spent part of her afternoon planning and preparing a meal that must be nutritious enough to sustain working family members while remaining within the strict boundaries of their budget. The main components are typically bread, purchased from the cheapest available source, and some form of protein that might be bacon fat, a small portion of cheese, or occasionally a bit of actual meat. Vegetables, when they appear at all, are usually root vegetables like potatoes or turnips that provide bulk and some nutritional value at minimal cost. During summer months, Mary might occasionally purchase fruits or vegetables that are just beginning to spoil and therefore available at reduced prices. The family has learned to appreciate foods that more prosperous households would consider barely edible: day-old bread, slightly wilted vegetables, and meat that must be cooked immediately to remain safe. The preparation and consumption of the evening meal transforms their cramped living space into something that temporarily resembles a normal family gathering. The single wooden table that serves multiple functions throughout the day becomes the center of family life. Emma and William share the day's experiences from their school and street adventures. James describes interesting people or places encountered during his delivery routes. Sarah and Thomas discuss workplace news, which workers have been promoted, laid off, or injured, and how these changes might affect the broader industrial community. These dinner conversations serve important functions beyond simple family bonding. Information sharing about employment opportunities, workplace conditions, and community events helps family members make strategic decisions about their own work situations. News about illness or injury among neighbors allows the family to prepare for similar risks in their own lives. Discussions about prices and availability of goods help Mary plan more effective household management strategies. As evening deepens into night, the family's activities wind down in the gradual way necessitated by their living situation. There's no electric lighting, so all activities must be planned around the availability of daylight or the family's limited supply of candles and lamp oil. Reading, when it occurs at all, must be completed while light is available. Any tasks requiring fine detail work, mending clothes, completing piecework or school assignments, are prioritized during the remaining daylight hours. The process of preparing for sleep in such cramped quarters requires the same careful choreography that characterizes all aspects of their daily life. Personal hygiene is limited by the availability of water and privacy, but family members take turns using the basin for evening washing. Clothing is arranged carefully. Work clothes are hung or folded to minimize wrinkles and wear, while sleeping garments are simple and practical rather than comfortable. The sleeping arrangements reflect both the practical necessities and the social norms of their situation. Parents and children share the same small room, but careful attention is paid to maintaining appropriate boundaries of privacy and decency. Younger children sleep together for warmth and space efficiency, while older family members are positioned to provide supervision and protection. As you imagine yourself observing this family settling into sleep, consider the sounds that characterize nighttime in their neighborhood. The building itself seems to breathe, with the collective rhythms of its residents' floorboards creaking as people move about their evening routines, muffled conversations through thin walls, the occasional sound of crying children or arguments between neighbors. From the street below come the sounds of late-shift workers returning home, the clip-clop of horse-drawn vehicles making deliveries, and the distant noise of machinery that operates throughout the night in some factories. The air in their sleeping quarters carries the accumulated sense of daily life: cooking odors, the residual dampness from laundry, the industrial smells that cling to work clothes, and the particular odor of too many people sharing too small a space. Yet this environment, harsh as it might seem to modern sensibilities, represents security and family unity for the Hartwells and millions of families like them throughout Victorian Britain. Their sleep, when it comes, is the deep rest of physical exhaustion combined with the satisfaction of another day, survived through mutual effort and careful resource management. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges and the same routines, but also the same opportunities for small victories and family solidarity in the face of difficult circumstances. As we leave the Hartwell family to their rest, we carry with us an understanding of how the vast majority of Victorian citizens actually lived their daily lives, far removed from the gas-lit elegance and technological marvels that dominate popular images of the era, but rich with human resilience, family bonds, and the quiet dignity of people making the best of circumstances largely beyond their control. As we drift deeper into our exploration of Victorian Britain, imagine yourself stepping into the methodical world of Charles Booth, a man whose patient dedication to understanding poverty would reshape how society viewed its most vulnerable members. Picture the year 1886 and envision yourself accompanying this quietly determined figure as he embarks on one of the most comprehensive social investigations of the 19th century. Charles Booth was not born to poverty himself. The son of a prosperous Liverpool merchant family, he had built a successful shipping business by the time he reached middle age. Yet something about the casual assumptions made by politicians and social reformers about London as poor troubled him deeply. When a fellow member of Parliament claimed that 25% of London's working population lived in extreme poverty, Booth's analytical mind balked at accepting such a specific figure without proper evidence. His response was characteristically methodical. If accurate information about poverty didn't exist, he would create it himself. Imagine yourself walking alongside Booth as he begins his investigation in the autumn of 1886. He's a tall, lean figure with the measured gait of someone accustomed to careful observation. His notebook is always present, and his pen moves across the pages with the steady rhythm of a man recording facts rather than impressions. Unlike the casual social tourists who occasionally ventured into London's poorer districts to satisfy their curiosity, Booth approaches his task with the systematic precision of a scientist studying a natural phenomenon. His methodology unfolds with remarkable thoroughness. Rather than relying on government statistics or charitable organization reports, Booth decides to gather information directly from the people who know the poor best, the school board visitors, whose job requires them to enter every household in their assigned districts. These visitors, primarily women, travel daily through the maze of tenements, lodging houses, and converted buildings that shelter London's working population. Their responsibilities include ensuring that children of school age are attending classes, investigating cases of truancy, and maintaining detailed records of family circumstances. Picture yourself observing one of Booth's early meetings with Miss Helena Davies, a school board visitor who has worked in Whitechapel for over 8 years. The setting is a modest office in a converted Georgian house that now serves as the local school board headquarters. The room smells of ink, paper, and the coal fire that provides the only heat during London's damp autumn months. Miss Davies spreads out her carefully maintained records across a worn wooden table, each page representing dozens of families whose circumstances she knows with intimate precision. As Miss Davies describes her daily rounds, you can almost see the mental map forming in Booth's mind. She speaks of Mrs. Patterson, a widow with 5 children who takes in washing to supplement her meagre pension from her husband's former employer. Her voice carries the particular tone of someone who has learned to describe hardship without becoming overwhelmed by its emotional weight. She mentions the Thompson family, where the father's irregular employment as a dock worker means the household income varies dramatically from week to week, creating cycles of relative plenty followed by periods of genuine hunger. Booth's questions reveal his systematic approach to understanding poverty. He doesn't ask for dramatic stories or exceptional cases, but for the ordinary details that reveal patterns. How many families in a given street have regular employment? What percentage of household income typically goes to rent? How do families respond when the primary wage earner becomes ill or injured? His notebook fills with precise observations and careful calculations, each entry contributing to a comprehensive picture of how London's poor actually live. The collaboration between Booth and the school board visitors develops into something resembling a scientific partnership. These women, who might otherwise have remained anonymous functionaries in the educational bureaucracy, become Booth's primary research assistants. Their daily experiences provide him with information that no government survey or charitable investigation could have gathered. They know which families have pawned their possessions to pay rent, which children arrive at school without having eaten breakfast, and which households are one crisis away from complete destitution. Imagine yourself accompanying Miss Davies on one of her typical rounds, observing the process that provides Booth with his raw data. Her day begins early as she makes her way through streets that become progressively narrower and more crowded as she moves deeper into the district. Her first stop is a boarding house where several families share accommodation designed for half their number. The building's entrance opens directly onto the street, with no buffer between the public thoroughfare and the private living spaces within. The landlord, a thin man with prematurely grey hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone managing an impossible situation, greets Miss Davies with a mixture of respect and wariness. He knows that her reports can affect his ability to continue housing families, but he also understands that she represents one of the few official agencies that takes any interest in the welfare of his tenants. Together, they climb the narrow stairs to visit the Morrison family, who occupy a single room on the second floor. Mrs. Morrison, a woman in her early 30s who looks considerably older, attempts to maintain some semblance of domestic order in a space that serves as bedroom, kitchen and workspace for herself and her 3 children. Her husband works irregularly as a street sweeper, a job that provides income only when weather conditions and municipal budgets align favorably. Miss Davies conducts her interview with the practiced efficiency of someone who understands that these families have little time to spare for bureaucratic requirements. She notes that all 3 Morrison children are of school age, that 2 are attending regularly, while the youngest has been kept home due to a persistent cough that the family cannot afford to have treated by a physician. She observes that the family's possessions are minimal but well maintained, suggesting people who take pride in their circumstances despite their obvious limitations. The information Miss Davies gathers goes far beyond simple attendance records. She notes the family's approximate weekly income, their primary sources of food, the condition of their clothing, and any obvious health problems among family members. Her trained eye can assess nutritional status, recognize signs of specific diseases, and evaluate the family's overall stability or vulnerability. These observations, multiplied across hundreds of similar visits, provide Booth with the detailed information necessary for his comprehensive analysis. As Booth compiles information from multiple school board visitors across different districts of London, patterns begin to emerge that challenge many contemporary assumptions about poverty. His data reveals that the poor are not a uniform population, but rather a complex mixture of people facing different types of economic challenges. Some families struggle with irregular employment, where the primary wage earner has marketable skills but cannot find consistent work. Others deal with regular employment that simply doesn't provide enough income to meet basic needs. Still others face the particular challenges of illness, disability, or family circumstances that prevent normal participation in the labor market. Picture Booth in his study during the long winter evenings of 1887, surrounded by stacks of carefully organized notes and preliminary maps. The room is lit by gas lamps that cast a steady yellowish light across the papers scattered across his desk. He's developed a color coding system that allows him to visualize the economic status of different areas of London. Streets where families generally achieve a modest but sustainable standard of living are marked in blue. Areas of significant hardship but not desperate poverty are indicated in yellow. The districts where families struggle to meet basic survival needs are marked in red, while the darkest areas, those where people live in conditions of genuine destitution, are colored in black. The process of creating these maps requires Booth to make countless small decisions about how to categorize and represent the information he's gathered. A family might be relatively stable during periods when the father finds regular work, but slip into serious hardship when employment becomes irregular. Children's health might improve during summer months when food is more affordable and living conditions are less harsh, but deteriorate during winter when heating costs consume money needed for nutrition. Booth's analysis reveals the inadequacy of simple explanations for poverty. Popular Victorian thinking often attributed economic hardship to personal moral failings, laziness, drunkenness, or lack of thrift. But Booth's data shows families where the adults work consistently and manage their limited resources carefully, yet still cannot achieve economic security. His investigation uncovers the structural factors that trap people in poverty: wages that are insufficient to meet basic needs, employment that is irregular or seasonal, and living costs that consume the vast majority of working-class incomes. The maps that emerge from Booth's work become powerful tools for visualizing economic inequality. When completed, they show London as a complex patchwork of economic circumstances, with areas of relative prosperity existing alongside districts of serious hardship. The geographic patterns reveal how poverty concentrates in specific areas, often related to proximity to particular types of employment or transportation networks. Imagine yourself examining one of Booth's completed maps, tracing the colored streets that represent different levels of economic well-being. The map shows how poverty creates its own geography areas where landlords can charge high rents for substandard accommodation because tenants have few alternatives. Districts where shops cater to customers who must purchase food and goods in tiny quantities because they lack the resources for bulk buying, and neighborhoods where the concentration of economic hardship creates additional challenges for residents. Booth's investigation extends beyond simple statistical analysis to include detailed written descriptions of different areas and their characteristics. His prose style reflects his merchant background, precise, factual, and focused on concrete details rather than emotional appeals. When he describes a particular street or district, he notes the condition of the buildings, the types of employment available to residents, the presence or absence of charitable institutions, and the general atmosphere of the area. One of his most detailed descriptions focuses on a section of Bethnal Green, where his investigation reveals the complex relationship between employment opportunities and living conditions. The area houses workers from several different industries: furniture makers, textile workers, and various types of skilled craftsmen who work in small workshops rather than large factories. The irregular nature of this work creates a population that is skilled and hard-working, but economically vulnerable. Booth observes that the furniture makers in this district often possess considerable skill and take genuine pride in their craftsmanship. However, their work is subject to seasonal variations and changes in fashion that can dramatically affect demand for their products. During busy periods, these workers might earn wages that allow for a reasonably comfortable standard of living, but during slow periods, the same families might struggle to pay rent and purchase adequate food. The economic vulnerability of skilled workers challenges simple assumptions about the relationship between ability and prosperity. Booth's investigation reveals that many poor families include members with valuable skills and strong work ethics, but who nonetheless live in conditions of economic uncertainty due to factors beyond their individual control. As Booth's work progresses through 1887 and into 1888, his team expands to include additional researchers and assistants. The scope of the investigation grows to encompass not just economic conditions, but also social and cultural patterns within London's poor districts. They document the informal networks of mutual support that help families survive economic crises, the role of religious and charitable organizations in providing assistance, and the various strategies that people develop to cope with economic uncertainty. Picture yourself observing one of the team meetings where Booth and his assistants discuss their findings and plan additional research. The atmosphere combines the excitement of scientific discovery with the sobering awareness of the human suffering their statistics represent. They've developed their own vocabulary for discussing different types of poverty and economic hardship, creating categories and distinctions that allow for more precise analysis than the crude generalizations typically used in political discussions. The meeting room where they gather reflects Booth's systematic approach to the investigation. Large maps cover the walls, marked with the evolving color-coding system that represents their growing understanding of London's economic geography. Tables are covered with organized stacks of interview notes, statistical summaries, and preliminary reports. The atmosphere is that of a research laboratory dedicated to understanding a complex social phenomenon. One of the most significant discoveries emerging from their work concerns the relationship between housing costs and poverty. Booth's data reveals that families in the poorest districts often pay proportionally more for housing than families in more prosperous areas, despite receiving accommodation of much lower quality. This occurs because landlords in poor areas can charge high rents relative to the quality of their properties, knowing that tenants have few alternatives and little bargaining power. The housing situation creates what Booth recognizes as a self-perpetuating cycle of hardship. Families pay such a high percentage of their income for rent that they have insufficient resources for adequate food, clothing, or healthcare. This affects their ability to maintain employment or seek better opportunities, which in turn limits their ability to afford better housing. The geographic concentration of poverty means that children grow up in environments where educational and economic opportunities are severely limited, making it difficult for families to improve their circumstances across generations. Booth's investigation also reveals the inadequacy of existing charitable efforts to address the scope of poverty in London. While individual charitable organizations might provide significant help to specific families, the total scale of need far exceeds the resources available through private philanthropy. His data suggests that effective poverty reduction would require systematic changes in wages, housing policies, and employment practices rather than simply increased charitable giving. The publication of Booth's preliminary findings in 1889 creates considerable controversy in London's political and social circles. His conclusion that approximately 30% of London's population lives in poverty, a figure significantly higher than previous estimates, challenges comfortable assumptions about the extent of hardship in the nation's capital. The detailed maps and careful documentation make it difficult for critics to dismiss his findings as exaggerated or inaccurate. Picture the response to Booth's work in the drawing rooms and clubs where London's elite gather to discuss social questions. Some readers are genuinely shocked by the extent of poverty his investigation reveals. Others question his methodology or suggest that his findings apply only to the specific districts he studied most intensively. Still others argue that his data confirms the need for various types of social reform, though they disagree about what specific changes would be most effective. The controversy surrounding Booth's work reflects broader Victorian anxieties about social change and economic inequality. The comfortable assumption that prosperity and poverty result primarily from individual character traits becomes harder to maintain when confronted with Booth's systematic documentation of structural economic problems. His maps make visible patterns of hardship that many preferred to remain hidden or ignored. As we drift away from Booth's methodical world of statistics and maps, we carry with us an appreciation for the power of careful observation and systematic analysis to reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden. His patient work provides us with a window into the actual living conditions of Victorian London's poor, moving beyond stereotype and assumption to document the complex realities of economic hardship. The rhythm of Booth's investigation, the steady accumulation of individual observations into broader patterns of understanding, mirrors the daily rhythms of the families he studied. Just as working-class families developed systematic approaches to managing limited resources and coping with economic uncertainty, Booth developed systematic approaches to understanding and documenting their circumstances. His work reminds us that behind every statistic lie individual families like the Hartwells we met earlier, each developing their own strategies for survival and maintaining their dignity despite difficult circumstances. The colored lines on Booth's maps represent not just economic categories, but actual streets where real people lived, worked, and raised their children under conditions that tested human resilience in countless ways. As our journey through Victorian London deepens, imagine yourself stepping into the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. Where fear and mystery would soon intertwine with the daily struggles of poverty we've already explored. The gaslight flickers weakly through the perpetual haze of coal smoke and river mist, casting long shadows that seem to shift and breathe with their own mysterious life. Here, in these narrow alleyways and crowded courtyards, one of history's most enduring mysteries would unfold, transforming a district already marked by hardship into a place where terror and folklore would forever intersect. Picture yourself walking slowly through Dorset Street on a typical evening in late August 1888, before the name Jack the Ripper had entered the vocabulary of fear. The street represents one of the most impoverished areas that Charles Booth would later mark in the darkest colors on his poverty maps. The buildings lean inward, their upper stories nearly touching across the narrow roadway, creating a sense of enclosure that makes the sky seem far away even during daylight hours. The residents of this area live in what Victorian society calls common lodging houses, establishments that provide basic shelter for those who can afford to pay a few pence per night for a bed, or even less for the privilege of sleeping upright in a chair. These lodging houses operate according to their own informal economy and social structure, serving as temporary homes for people whose circumstances make conventional housing impossible. Imagine yourself observing the evening routine at one of these establishments, a four-story building that houses nearly 60 people on any given night. The ground floor consists of a common room where residents gather around a central fire, sharing news, food when it's available, and the companionship that helps make their difficult circumstances more bearable. The air is thick with the mingled sense of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, gin when someone has managed to afford it, and the persistent dampness that characterizes buildings where too many people live without adequate ventilation. The clientele of the lodging houses includes people from many different backgrounds, united by their current economic circumstances. There are dock workers whose employment varies with the arrival of ships and the seasonal patterns of trade. Former soldiers, some bearing visible wounds from colonial conflicts, struggle to adapt to civilian life without the support systems that might help them reintegrate into regular society. Women who work as seamstresses, flower sellers, or in other occupations that provide minimal and irregular income find these establishments their only option for shelter. Among the regular residents of the Whitechapel lodging houses are women whose circumstances have led them to engage in what Victorian society euphemistically calls unfortunate occupations. These women, often referred to simply as unfortunates, represent one of the most vulnerable populations in an already vulnerable community. Their daily lives involve navigating dangers that extend far beyond the general hardships of poverty, yet they remain integrated into the broader social fabric of the district's poorest areas. Picture Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends and neighbours as Polly, making her way through the familiar streets on the evening of August 30th, 1888. She's a woman in her early 40s whose life has been shaped by a series of circumstances and choices that led her to these streets. Her day follows patterns established by necessity rather than preference, seeking casual employment when it's available, managing the complex social relationships that provide safety and mutual support among the lodging house residents, and navigating the dangers that are an unavoidable part of life in this district. Polly's evening begins at the lodging house where she's been staying when she can afford the daily fee. The building's kitchen serves as an informal social center where residents share information about employment opportunities, discuss neighborhood news, and maintain the personal connections that provide emotional support in an otherwise isolating environment. The conversations flow in the particular rhythm of people who have learned to find humor and companionship despite circumstances that might overwhelm those less experienced with hardship. As evening deepens toward night, Polly makes her way onto the streets, following routes that have become as familiar to her as the pathways of her childhood. The district's geography creates its own patterns of safety and danger. Certain areas are known to be relatively secure during particular hours, while others are best avoided entirely. The women who work these streets have developed their own informal networks of communication, warning each other about potential dangers and sharing information about which areas are experiencing increased police attention. The streets themselves seem to pulse with their own mysterious energy during the late evening hours. Gas lamps provide pools of yellow light separated by stretches of deep shadow, creating a landscape that shifts constantly between illumination and darkness. The sounds of the district change as conventional daytime activities give way to the nighttime economy. The clip-clop of hansom cabs carrying passengers to and from more prosperous areas, the distant sounds of public houses closing for the evening, and the occasional shouts or conversations of people whose work or circumstances keep them active during the hours when most of London sleeps. In the early morning hours of August 31st, imagine yourself as an invisible observer, as Polly's life intersects with something that will transform her from an individual struggling with poverty into a figure in one of history's most enduring mysteries. The encounter occurs in Bucks Row, a narrow street that connects the busier thoroughfares of the district. The location is characteristic of the area's geography, a place where someone might walk without being observed from the main roads, yet close enough to populated areas that sounds of distress might be heard. What happens in those dark, early morning hours remains forever shrouded in mystery, but its immediate aftermath would begin a sequence of events that would capture the attention of the entire world. Polly Nichols becomes the first victim in what newspapers would later call the Whitechapel murders, though at the time, her death seems like another tragic but not entirely unusual occurrence in a district where violence and sudden death are unfortunate but regular realities. The discovery of Polly's body by Police Constable John Neal during his regular patrol rounds sets in motion a police investigation that reveals both the limitations of Victorian law enforcement and the particular challenges of investigating crimes in London's poorest districts. Picture Constable Neal, a man in his 30s who has walked these streets for several years, approaching what he initially assumes is simply another person sleeping rough in a doorway, a common sight that usually requires nothing more than a gentle nudge to encourage movement to a legal resting place. The realization that he has discovered something far more serious transforms Neal's routine patrol into the beginning of one of the most famous criminal investigations in history. His training has prepared him for the standard types of crimes that occur in his district: theft, drunken disturbances, domestic violence, and the occasional assault. However, the circumstances surrounding Polly's death suggest something beyond the usual range of urban crime, requiring investigation techniques that stretch the limits of Victorian police methodology. The police response to the discovery reflects both the resources and limitations of law enforcement in London's East End. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who will become one of the central figures in the investigation, represents the new breed of professional detective that Scotland Yard has begun developing. His approach combines traditional police work, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and following up on tips from the public, with more systematic methods borrowed from other fields of investigation. Picture Aberline examining the scene in Bucks Row as dawn breaks over Whitechapel, trying to piece together the sequence of events that led to this discovery. The narrow street offers few clues beyond the immediate physical evidence, and the transient nature of the local population means that potential witnesses may have already moved on to other districts. The investigation must navigate the complex social relationships and informal economies that characterize life in the poorest areas of London. The challenge of investigating crimes in Whitechapel extends beyond simple police work to encompass broader questions about how Victorian society understands and responds to violence against its most vulnerable members. The victims of what will become known as the Jack the Ripper murders are women whose circumstances place them at the margins of respectable society, yet whose deaths will eventually command more public attention than most crimes against members of the middle or upper classes. As the investigation proceeds through September 1888, additional crimes occur that suggest a pattern beyond random urban violence. Picture yourself observing the growing sense of unease that begins to permeate the district as news of each new incident spreads through the informal communication networks that connect lodging houses, public houses, and the various places where the area's residents gather. The second major incident occurs on September 8th, when Annie Chapman's body is discovered in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. The location represents another characteristic Whitechapel setting, a narrow courtyard accessible from the street but hidden from casual observation. The circumstances surrounding Annie's death suggest that the perpetrator possesses knowledge of the district's geography that allows movement through the area without attracting attention. Annie Chapman's life, like Polly Nichols's, reflects the complex circumstances that bring women to Whitechapel streets. She was a woman who had once lived in more comfortable circumstances, but whose life had been gradually narrowed by a series of personal and economic difficulties. Her daily routine involved the same careful management of limited resources and navigation of urban dangers that characterized the lives of many women in similar circumstances. The investigation of Annie's death reveals additional aspects of life in Whitechapel that complicate traditional police work. The residents of the area have developed their own informal systems of justice and conflict resolution that operate parallel to official law enforcement. Information that might be freely shared with authorities in middle-class areas may be withheld in communities where residents have learned to be wary of official intervention. Picture Detective Inspector Aberline conducting interviews with potential witnesses in the cramped common rooms of lodging houses, trying to gather information from people whose relationship with authority figures has been shaped by experiences of poverty, discrimination, and social marginalization. The interviews require sensitivity to the complex social dynamics of the community while also pursuing leads that might solve increasingly serious crimes. The formal investigation begins to intersect with the informal information networks that exist within the community. Residents of the area share their own theories about the crimes and their own observations about suspicious behavior or unfamiliar people in the district. However, the reliability of this information varies considerably, influenced by the community's general suspicion of outsiders and the tendency for rumors to spread and evolve as they pass through multiple conversations. By late September 1888, the crimes have begun to attract attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. Newspaper coverage transforms local incidents into matters of national interest, though the reporting often reveals more about Victorian attitudes toward poverty and social class than about the actual circumstances of the crimes. The coverage tends to sensationalize the exotic and dangerous aspects of life in the East End, while largely ignoring the broader social and economic factors that create the conditions in which such crimes can occur. The media attention brings both benefits and complications to the investigation. Public interest generates tips and potential leads that might not otherwise emerge, but it also creates pressure for rapid results that may compromise the methodical approach necessary for effective police work. The newspaper coverage creates its own mythology around the crimes, introducing dramatic elements and speculation that often obscure rather than clarify the actual facts of the cases. Picture yourself reading one of the early newspaper accounts of the Whitechapel murders, noting how the reporting style reflects Victorian sensibilities about crime, poverty, and social class. The language used to describe the victims often emphasizes their membership in the criminal classes or their deviation from respectable feminine behavior, suggesting that their circumstances somehow make them appropriate targets for violence. This framing allows middle-class readers to feel both fascinated and safely removed from the events being described. The most dramatic night in the sequence of crimes occurs on September 30th, when two murders take place within a few hours of each other. The double event, as newspapers later call it, seems to demonstrate that the perpetrator can move through the district with confidence and knowledge of local geography. The locations of the crimes, Dutfield's Yard and Mitre Square, represent different types of spaces within the East End's urban landscape, suggesting familiarity with various routes and hiding places throughout the area. Elizabeth Stride's death in Dutfield's Yard occurs in close proximity to a club that serves the area's immigrant population, adding ethnic and political dimensions to the investigation. The yard itself represents one of the many semi-private spaces that characterize the district's geography, not quite public streets, but not fully private property either. These liminal spaces provide both opportunities and dangers for the area's most vulnerable residents. Catherine Edow's death in Mitre Square, occurring less than an hour later and in a different area, suggests mobility and planning that challenge assumptions about the random nature of urban crime. The rapid succession of incidents creates fear that extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass the broader community of women whose circumstances require them to be on the streets during nighttime hours. The investigation of the double event reveals the limitations of Victorian police communication and coordination systems. Information gathered at one crime scene cannot be quickly transmitted to officers working in other areas, making it difficult to establish patterns or coordinate responses to rapidly developing situations. The geographic extent of the East End and the complexity of its street layout create additional challenges for law enforcement agencies trying to patrol effectively. As autumn deepens into winter, the psychological impact of the crimes begins to transform daily life throughout Whitechapel. Picture yourself observing the subtle changes in behavior and routine that reflect the community's growing sense of vulnerability. Women who previously moved freely through the district during evening hours begin traveling in groups or avoiding certain areas entirely. The informal social networks that provide mutual support and protection become more important as formal law enforcement proves unable to provide adequate security. The lodging houses develop their own security measures, with residents taking turns keeping watch during the night hours and establishing protocols for ensuring that everyone returns safely from evening activities. The common rooms where residents gather become centers for sharing information about suspicious activity and coordinating informal security arrangements. The final crime in the canonical sequence occurs on November 9th, when Mary Jane Kelly's body is discovered in her small rented room on Miller's Court. This incident differs from the previous crimes in several important ways. It occurs in a private space rather than a semi-public location. The victim is younger than the previous targets, and the circumstances suggest that the perpetrator spent considerable time at the scene. Mary Kelly's death represents both the culmination of the series of crimes and the point at which the mystery deepens beyond any possibility of simple resolution. The private nature of her accommodation, a single small room that she rented independently rather than sharing lodging house space, suggests different social circumstances than those of the previous victims. Yet her murder occurs in the same general area and appears to be connected to the same perpetrator. The investigation of Mary Kelly's death provides the most detailed physical evidence in any of the cases, yet this evidence raises as many questions as it answers. The crime scene suggests both careful planning and considerable risk-taking, indicating a perpetrator who is either extremely confident or increasingly reckless. The timing of the incident, occurring during the Lord Mayor's Day celebrations when police attention is focused elsewhere, suggests awareness of law enforcement patterns and priorities. Picture Detective Inspector Aberline, standing in the narrow confines of Miller's Court, trying to understand how this crime connects to the previous incidents, while also representing something qualitatively different. The physical evidence is more extensive than in previous cases, yet the passage of time and the limitations of Victorian forensic techniques mean that much of this evidence cannot be analyzed with the precision that modern investigators would expect. As winter settles over Whitechapel and no additional murders occur, the active investigation gradually winds down, though it never officially closes. The absence of new incidents creates its own mystery. Has the perpetrator died, moved away, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply stopped killing for reasons that remain unknowable? The lack of resolution means that the crimes transition from active police investigation to enduring folklore and speculation. The transformation of the Whitechapel murders from contemporary crimes to historical mystery reflects the particular way that these incidents captured public imagination. The combination of mystery, violence, and social transgression created a narrative that transcended the immediate circumstances of the crimes to become part of the broader cultural mythology surrounding Victorian London. Picture yourself observing how the story of Jack the Ripper evolves in the months and years following the crimes. The lack of a definitive solution allows for endless speculation and theory building, with each new generation of investigators and amateur detectives proposing their own explanations for the identity and motives of the perpetrator. The mystery becomes a canvas onto which people can project their own theories about crime, society, and human nature. The enduring fascination with the Jack the Ripper case reflects something deeper than simple curiosity about an unsolved crime. The murders occurred at a moment when Victorian society was grappling with rapid social change, urban growth, and increasing awareness of social inequality. The crimes seemed to embody anxieties about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of modern urban life. The victims of the murders, women whose circumstances had placed them at the margins of respectable society, become in death more famous than they ever were in life. Their stories, filtered through newspaper accounts and later retellings, often lose the specific details of their individual circumstances in favor of generic narratives about fallen women and urban danger. Yet their deaths also draw attention to the broader social conditions that created their vulnerability. As we drift away from the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, we carry with us an understanding of how mystery and folklore emerge from the intersection of crime, poverty, and social anxiety. The Jack the Ripper case demonstrates how historical events can transcend their immediate circumstances to become part of the collective cultural imagination, taking on meanings and significance that extend far beyond their original context. The crimes occurred within the same community that Charles Booth was systematically studying, among people whose daily lives resembled those of the Hartwell family we observed in our first segment. The mystery that emerged from these tragic deaths reflects the broader mysteries of urban poverty, social inequality, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience in the face of difficult circumstances. The narrow streets where these events unfolded continue to exist, though transformed by more than a century of urban development. Yet something of their original atmosphere persists in the collective memory, preserved in the endless retellings and re-examinations of events that remain as mysterious today as they were to the investigators who first walked through those gaslit shadows in search of answers that would forever elude their grasp. As our journey through Victorian Britain reaches its final movement, imagine yourself ascending from the narrow streets and shadowed alleys we've explored into an entirely different realm of existence. Picture yourself stepping through the polished oak doors of a grand townhouse in Belgravia, where the gaslight gleams warmly off crystal chandeliers and the air carries the subtle fragrance of hothouse flowers rather than coal smoke and industrial grime. Here, in the drawing rooms and country estates of Victorian England's wealthy elite, we encounter a world that existed simultaneously with the poverty of Whitechapel, yet remained as distant from it as if separated by centuries rather than merely miles. The contrast could not be more striking. While families like the Hartwells shared two cramped rooms with minimal furnishings, imagine yourself walking through the spacious corridors of Thornfield Manor, the country estate of Sir Edmund and Lady Charlotte Ashworth. The house, built in the previous century but extensively modernized during the 1880s, contains over 40 rooms spread across 4 floors, with additional servants' quarters in the basement and attic spaces. The Ashworth family, consisting of Sir Edmund, Lady Charlotte and their 3 adult children, occupies this vast space with a household staff of 26 people dedicated to maintaining their comfort and social position. Picture yourself in the morning room, where Lady Charlotte takes her breakfast, a sun-filled chamber overlooking manicured gardens that stretch toward a small, ornamental lake. The room itself is larger than the entire living space of most working-class families, furnished with delicate Sheraton chairs, a mahogany breakfast table, and walls lined with watercolor paintings depicting pastoral scenes that bear no resemblance to the industrial landscapes where most of her countrymen earn their daily bread. Lady Charlotte's morning routine unfolds with the measured precision of someone whose time is structured around social obligations rather than economic necessities. She rises at 9 o'clock, not because employment demands her presence at a particular hour, but because this timing allows for the proper sequence of activities that define a lady's day. Her personal maid, Margaret, has already prepared her morning attire, a silk dressing gown over a lawn nightgown, both items representing more fabric and finer materials than most working-class families own in their entire wardrobes. The breakfast service demonstrates the elaborate infrastructure required to maintain upper-class comfort. The food arrives through a complex system involving the kitchen staff, who begin their preparations before dawn, the scullery maids who have cleaned and polished the serving dishes, the footman who carries the trays through the house's corridors, and finally Margaret, who arranges everything according to Lady Charlotte's preferences before awakening her mistress. The breakfast itself represents abundance that would seem almost fantastical to families struggling with poverty. Fresh eggs from the estate's own hens, cream so thick it must be spooned rather than poured, butter churned that morning in the estate's dairy, bread baked in ovens that burn continuously throughout the day, and preserves made from fruits grown in the estate's extensive gardens. The quantity of food casually available for a single person's morning meal could sustain a working-class family for several days. Yet Lady Charlotte approaches her breakfast with the same careful consideration that Mary Hartwell applies to stretching a few pence worth of provisions through an entire day. The difference lies not in the attention paid to the task, but in the nature of the choices being made. Lady Charlotte must decide between different types of imported tea, consider whether the hothouse grapes are sufficiently ripe, and determine which of several varieties of freshly baked bread best suits her mood this particular morning. Picture yourself observing the invisible labor that surrounds every aspect of Lady Charlotte's daily routine. While she contemplates her breakfast choices, multiple servants are already engaged in maintaining the environment that makes such choices possible. The kitchen staff has been working for hours to ensure that every item appears on the breakfast table at the proper temperature and in perfect condition. The housemaids have cleaned and arranged the morning room to create an atmosphere of effortless elegance. The gardeners have tended the flowers that provide the room's decorative arrangements, and the estate's farm workers have produced the dairy products and fresh ingredients that make the meal possible. This elaborate support system operates according to its own complex social hierarchy, with each servant understanding their precise role in maintaining the household's smooth functioning. The butler, Mr. Whitmore, occupies a position of considerable responsibility and respectability within the servant community, managing the household's daily operations and serving as an intermediary between the family and the lower-ranking staff. His own quarters are more comfortable than the accommodations available to most working-class families, yet he remains essentially a dependent member of someone else's household. The morning continues with Lady Charlotte's correspondence, a task that reveals the extensive social networks maintained by the Victorian upper classes. Picture yourself observing as she reviews invitations to dinner parties, charity committee meetings, and seasonal social events that structure the calendar of the wealthy. Her writing desk, crafted from exotic woods and fitted with silver implements, holds stationery that costs more per sheet than many working-class families spend on food in a day. The letters she writes and receives connect her to a world of country houses, London townhouses, and continental resorts, where members of her social class move according to seasonal patterns that have little relationship to economic necessity. The season, the annual cycle of social events centered in London during the spring months, requires extensive preparation, coordination, and expense that would be incomprehensible to families whose seasonal concerns center on keeping warm in winter and finding work during periods of industrial slowdown. Lady Charlotte's involvement in charitable activities provides one of the few points where the world of the wealthy intersects with the realities of poverty, though this intersection occurs in carefully managed and limited ways. Picture yourself accompanying her to a meeting of the Ladies' Benevolent Society, held in the drawing room of another grand townhouse, where a dozen women of similar social standing gather to discuss their efforts to assist the deserving poor. The meeting unfolds in an atmosphere of genteel concern, combined with fundamental ignorance about the actual conditions of working-class life. The ladies discuss organizing clothing drives for poor families, apparently unaware that the elaborate process of laundering and maintaining the donated garments might be impossible for families without adequate space, water, or fuel. They plan Christmas baskets filled with foods that require cooking facilities unavailable to many of their intended recipients. Their charitable impulses are genuine, but their solutions reflect their inability to imagine living conditions fundamentally different from their own experience. The conversation reveals assumptions about poverty that would be challenged by Charles Booth's systematic research, though it's unlikely that any of these ladies will read his detailed reports. They speak of the poor as a distinct and distant population, affected by moral failings that charitable intervention might address, rather than as people trapped by economic structures and employment patterns that create systematic disadvantages. The possibility that their own comfort depends partially on the low wages paid to working-class families never enters the discussion. Meanwhile, in other parts of London and the countryside, The male members of upper-class families pursue their own activities within equally elaborate social and economic frameworks. Picture Sir Edmund Ashworth in his study, reviewing reports from the managers who oversee his various business interests. His wealth derives from multiple sources: agricultural rents from tenant farmers, dividends from railway investments, profits from manufacturing enterprises, and income from government bonds, creating a diversified portfolio that insulates him from the economic uncertainties that plague working-class families. Sir Edmund's business activities connect him indirectly to the industrial processes that employ families like the Hartwells, though he experiences these connections primarily through financial abstractions rather than human realities. The factories that generate his investment returns are managed by others, and his understanding of industrial conditions comes through reports that emphasize profits and productivity rather than working conditions or employee welfare. The study where Sir Edmund conducts his business represents another demonstration of the resources available to the wealthy. The room contains more books than most working-class families encounter in their entire lives, maps of railway systems and colonial territories that represent investment opportunities, and writing materials of qualities that reflect the assumption that his correspondence deserves the finest available supplies. The fireplace burns continuously during cool weather, consuming in a single day quantities of coal that working-class families must budget carefully throughout an entire winter. Picture yourself observing Sir Edmund's meeting with his estate manager, Mr. Davidson, who reports on the productivity of the agricultural operations that provide one stream of the family's income. The conversation reveals the complex relationships between landed wealth and rural poverty that parallel the urban disparities we've already explored. The tenant farmers who work Sir Edmund's lands live in conditions that, while different from urban slums, involve their own forms of economic vulnerability and limited opportunity. The agricultural workers employed on the estate earn wages that, while sufficient to avoid the desperate poverty of urban slums, provide little more than basic subsistence. Their tied cottages, housing that comes with employment but can be lost if work ends, create a form of dependency that mirrors the limited options available to urban workers. The seasonal nature of agricultural work creates periods of hardship that require the same careful resource management that characterizes urban working-class life. Yet Sir Edmund's relationship to this rural poverty remains mediated through his estate manager's reports and his own periodic visits to inspect the property. The actual living conditions of agricultural workers remain largely invisible to him, except when specific problems require his attention. The system operates to provide him with income while insulating him from direct knowledge of the human costs involved in generating that wealth. The social calendar of the Victorian upper classes creates its own rhythm of seasonal movement and elaborate entertainment that demonstrates the resources available to families like the Ashworths. Picture yourself observing the preparations for the family's annual Christmas house party, an event that will bring 30 guests to Thornfield Manor for a week of entertainment and social interaction. The logistics of hosting such an event reveal the elaborate infrastructure required to maintain upper-class social life. Additional temporary staff must be hired to supplement the regular household servants. Guest rooms must be prepared with fresh linens, flowers, and amenities. The kitchen staff must plan and execute meals for 45 people, including elaborate multi-course dinners that demonstrate both the host's resources and their chef's capabilities. The stables must accommodate the horses and carriages of arriving guests, while the household's regular routines must be adjusted to provide entertainment and comfort for visitors. The Christmas house party represents a level of casual expenditure that equals the annual income of multiple working-class families. The wines served with dinner, the imported delicacies featured at various meals, the flowers decorating the reception rooms, and the fuel required to heat the additional spaces all represent resources deployed simply to create an atmosphere of elegant hospitality. The guests' enjoyment of this elaborate entertainment depends on their ability to take such luxury for granted, treating abundance as a natural condition rather than a remarkable privilege. Picture yourself in the drawing room during one of the evening entertainments, observing the social interactions that occur within this carefully constructed environment. The conversation flows across topics that reflect the particular concerns and interests of people whose basic material needs are so thoroughly met that they can focus on aesthetic, intellectual, and social questions. They discuss the latest novels, debate political developments in terms of their effects on social stability rather than personal survival, and share gossip about the activities of their social circle. The women's evening attire represents another demonstration of the resources casually available to the wealthy. Lady Charlotte's dinner dress, crafted by London's most fashionable dressmaker, incorporates silk, lace, and embroidery that required dozens of hours of skilled labor to complete. The jewelry she wears casually for a family dinner party represents more wealth than most working-class families will accumulate in their entire lifetimes. Yet within her social context, such display is considered appropriate rather than ostentatious, reflecting expectations about how wealth should be expressed through material culture. The gentleman's evening wear, while less obviously elaborate, demonstrates similar assumptions about the resources that should be devoted to personal presentation. Sir Edmund's evening clothes, crafted by Savile Row tailors, represent the finest available materials worked by the most skilled craftsmen. His pocket watch, studs, and other accessories are made from precious metals and crafted with attention to detail that reflects both the owner's wealth and the artisan's skill. The casual nature with which such valuable items are worn reflects a level of economic security that allows for taking luxury for granted. As the evening's entertainment continues, picture yourself observing the particular forms of leisure that characterize upper-class social life. The drawing room contains a piano of exceptional quality, played by guests whose musical education represents years of expensive instruction. The library offers books and periodicals that provide intellectual stimulation, while the game tables allow for social interaction structured around activities that require no productive labor. The contrast with working-class leisure becomes particularly stark when we consider the different relationships to time and energy that characterize these two worlds. While working-class families must balance any leisure activities against the physical exhaustion of daily labor and the economic necessity of using non-working hours for household management, the wealthy can devote entire days to entertainment, social interaction, and personal cultivation. The house party continues with elaborate excursions that demonstrate the mobility available to the upper classes. Picture yourself observing the preparations for a hunting expedition, an activity that transforms the countryside into a playground for the wealthy, while employing numerous local people in supporting roles. The hunt requires beaters to drive game, stable hands to manage horses, servants to prepare and serve elaborate outdoor meals, and various other workers whose labor makes possible the gentleman's leisure activity. The hunting expedition reveals another aspect of the relationship between wealth and rural poverty. The elaborate ritual of the hunt depends on maintaining large estates as private preserves for the entertainment of the wealthy, while the surrounding population of agricultural workers and rural poor are excluded from lands that might otherwise provide them with supplementary food through poaching or foraging. The gamekeeper's cottage, while more substantial than the average agricultural worker's accommodation, exists primarily to serve the landowner's recreational interests, rather than to provide genuine economic opportunity for rural families. As our exploration of upper-class Victorian life draws toward its close, picture yourself in the conservatory of Thornfield Manor on a winter afternoon, where Lady Charlotte tends to exotic plants that flourish under glass, while the outside world experiences the harsh weather that creates additional hardships for working-class families. The conservatory itself represents a triumph of Victorian engineering and wealth, a controlled environment where tropical plants bloom while snow covers the landscape beyond the glass walls. This artificial paradise serves as a metaphor for the broader relationship between wealth and poverty in Victorian society. The wealthy create elaborate systems, architectural, social and economic, that insulate them from the natural and social forces that shape working-class experience. The conservatory's warmth and light exist independently of the weather conditions that affect families unable to afford adequate heating fuel. The exotic plants thrive regardless of the economic conditions that determine whether working-class families can purchase adequate food. Yet the conservatory also demonstrates the interconnectedness of Victorian society's different social levels. The coal that heats the space is mined by workers laboring in dangerous conditions for minimal wages. The glass that creates the structure is manufactured in factories where conditions resemble those we observed in our first segment. The exotic plants are maintained by gardeners whose wages, while better than factory workers, still require careful budgeting to support their families. Lady Charlotte's enjoyment of her winter garden depends on labor and resources drawn from the same economic system that creates the poverty we've explored throughout our journey. The difference lies not in complete separation between social classes, but in the unequal distribution of the benefits and costs generated by industrial society. As evening approaches and the house party guests prepare for another elaborate dinner, picture yourself taking a final survey of this world of privilege and abundance. The preparations for dinner involve the same careful coordination of labor and resources that we observed in working-class families, but directed toward creating luxury rather than achieving survival. The kitchen staff works with ingredients and equipment that represent abundance rather than scarcity, while the serving staff prepares to present the meal in settings that emphasize aesthetic pleasure rather than simple nourishment. The dinner conversation that will soon unfold around the mahogany table will likely touch on political and social questions that affect the entire nation, including the working-class families whose lives we've examined. However, these discussions will occur within the context of assumptions about social stability and economic progress that reflect the speaker's insulation from direct experience of poverty or economic uncertainty. Some guests might express concern about urban conditions or the need for charitable interventions to assist the deserving poor. Others might discuss the importance of maintaining social order and traditional relationships between different classes. Yet all of these conversations will occur within a framework that takes the speaker's own privilege for granted, while treating poverty as a problem to be managed rather than a systematic result of economic arrangements that benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor. As we prepare to leave this world of drawing rooms and country estates, we carry with us an understanding of how Victorian society's extremes of wealth and poverty existed not as separate universes, but as interconnected aspects of the same economic and social system. The comfort and luxury we've observed among the wealthy depends on the same industrial processes and labor relationships that create the hardships we witnessed in London's slums. The gas that lights the chandeliers in Belgravia drawing rooms is produced in the same gasworks that pollute the air breathed by working-class families. The profits that allow for elaborate country house entertainments are generated by factories where conditions resemble those we observed with the Hartwell family. The servants who maintain upper-class comfort often come from backgrounds similar to those of families struggling with urban poverty, their slightly better circumstances dependent on their willingness to dedicate their lives to serving others leisure and comfort. Yet the two worlds remain remarkably separate in terms of daily experience and mutual understanding. The wealthy move through their elaborate social routines, largely unaware of the specific conditions that shape working-class life, while the poor have limited opportunities to observe directly the luxury and comfort that their labor helps to create. This separation allows both groups to maintain assumptions about each other that are rarely tested by direct personal contact. The Victorian Age's technological achievements and economic growth create unprecedented opportunities for human comfort and development, yet these benefits are distributed in ways that create extreme disparities between social classes. The same society that produces Charles Booth's scientific approach to understanding poverty also generates the wealth that allows families like the Ashworths to live in luxury that previous generations could hardly have imagined. As we drift away from the warm light of the conservatory and the comfortable sounds of upper-class social life, we understand that the full picture of Victorian Britain requires holding these contrasting realities in our minds simultaneously. The narrow streets of Whitechapel and the spacious grounds of country estates, the careful budgeting of working-class families and the casual abundance of the wealthy, the systematic documentation of urban poverty and the elaborate entertainments of the privileged classes, all of these elements combine to create the complex social reality of 19th century Britain. The rhythms of daily life that we've explored in each segment, the factory schedules that structure working-class time, the methodical research that reveals patterns of poverty, the mysterious crimes that emerge from social desperation, and the seasonal social calendar that organizes upper-class leisure, all pulse together in the larger rhythm of a society undergoing rapid transformation while struggling to understand and manage the human consequences of economic and technological change. As our journey through Victorian Britain draws to its gentle close, imagine yourself stepping back from the specific streets and rooms we've explored to gain a broader perspective on the human landscape of the 19th century. We've walked alongside the Hartwell family through their daily struggles with poverty, observed Charles Booth's methodical documentation of urban hardship, witnessed how mystery and folklore emerged from the shadows of Whitechapel, and glimpsed the elaborate comfort that wealth could purchase in drawing rooms and country estates. Each of these worlds existed simultaneously, their inhabitants sharing the same London air, yet breathing entirely different atmospheres of possibility and constraint. The coal smoke that dimmed the sun over working-class neighborhoods also powered the machinery that generated wealth for the privileged classes. The gas that provided uncertain illumination in slum tenements burned more brightly in the chandeliers of Belgravia mansions. The Thames that carried industrial waste past the crowded docks, where families like the Hartwells struggled for survival, also flowed past the gardens of riverside estates, where the wealthy enjoyed carefully landscaped tranquility. Yet from our vantage point more than a century later, we can appreciate aspects of Victorian life that might have been invisible to people living within those circumstances. The resilience and dignity that working-class families maintained despite overwhelming economic pressures, the genuine scientific curiosity that motivated researchers like Charles Booth to document social conditions with unprecedented precision. The way that even tragic mysteries like the Whitechapel murders reflected broader questions about urban life, social inequality, and human vulnerability that remain relevant today. We can also recognize how the technological achievements and economic growth of the Victorian age, despite their unequal distribution, laid foundations for improvements in living conditions that would benefit future generations. The railway networks that initially served primarily wealthy passengers would eventually provide mobility for working families. The industrial processes that created harsh working conditions also generated wealth that could be redirected toward education, healthcare, and social improvements. The scientific methods that Charles Booth applied to understanding poverty would evolve into more comprehensive approaches to social research and policy development. The Victorian era's greatest achievement may have been the growing recognition that social conditions could be studied, understood, and ultimately improved through human effort and systematic intervention. While the immediate benefits of this recognition were limited, the intellectual and institutional foundations were established for the social reforms and welfare systems that would emerge in the 20th century. As you settle into the comfort of your present moment, you can appreciate the distance that time has created between your circumstances and those we've explored tonight. The basic securities that most people now take for granted: access to clean water, adequate healthcare, education, and employment protections were luxuries available only to the wealthy during the Victorian era. The social safety nets that provide support during economic hardship represent achievements that were hardly imaginable to families like the Hartwells, struggling with poverty that could destroy lives through circumstances entirely beyond individual control. Yet the human qualities we've observed, the capacity for maintaining dignity under difficult circumstances, the importance of family bonds and community support, the persistence of curiosity and hope despite overwhelming challenges, remain constant across generations and social changes. The Victorian era reminds us that human resilience and compassion can flourish even under conditions that test the limits of endurance. The mysteries that surrounded Victorian life, not just the unsolved crimes that captured public imagination, but the broader mysteries of how to create just and sustainable societies, continue to engage each generation's attention. The questions that Charles Booth pursued through his systematic research into poverty remain relevant today, though our methods for addressing them have evolved considerably. As the gentle rhythms of this historical exploration fade into the quieter rhythms of approaching sleep, let yourself rest in the knowledge that the struggles and achievements of previous generations contribute to the foundation of comfort and security that surrounds you tonight. The gaslit streets and smoky skies of Victorian London have given way to different urban landscapes, but the human capacity for adaptation, mutual support, and gradual progress continues to shape our collective future. Sleep well, knowing that you are connected through time to all the ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges with courage, dignity, and hope. Their stories, preserved in the patient records of researchers like Charles Booth and in the collective memory of communities that endured and ultimately transcended the hardships of industrial transformation, remind us that human society possesses remarkable capacity for both survival and improvement across the generations. The narrow streets and crowded rooms we visited tonight exist now primarily in historical imagination, but the human qualities we observed there, resilience, compassion, curiosity, and hope, continue to light our way forward through whatever challenges await future exploration. Rest peacefully in this continuing story of human endurance and gradual progress, knowing that you are both heir to past achievements and contributor to future possibilities. Good night.